Hey guys, today I'm going to be walking you through how we glue up panels like this solid oak panel out of boards like this individual board. It's a great skill for all woodworkers to know and understand because it's a simple trick that lets you take a board that's smaller than what you actually need and make something that's much larger. I know it seems like a simple process for those of you who have done it, but it can be really intimidating for starting woodworkers. So I wanted to go through the different steps that I take and some of the tips and tricks that I use along the way to end up with a nice, flat, sturdy panel that's going to last a long time. So stick around if you guys are curious how we do that. Thanks. I want to take a second to remind you guys, if you're not already following us, to give us a follow and hit that notification bell if you're on YouTube so you guys can be notified when we post this type of content in the future. To start out with our panel making process, we're going to start with our milling process. First step in making a panel is to identify which boards we want to use. We want to look at the color of the boards, the grain, and make sure that it's going to end up looking like what we want it to. Whether that's super consistent across the whole width or kind of crazy and sporadic. That's up to you guys. Once I pick out the specific boards I want to use for my panel, I want to look at the ends to make sure that there isn't any damage I'm going to have to avoid. For example, it's not uncommon at the end of a board to have what's called checking, or cracks in the wood. I want to make sure that before I cut to my rough length, I make sure to add on any checks at the end I'm going to have to cut off once I glue my panel up. You want to add 2 to 3 inches to the total length that you rough cut to, which gives you a little bit of flexibility come glue up time. If there's any snipe from your milling process, or if you end up having any grain or color mismatches, this gives you a little bit of flexibility in how you lay out your panel. Although I'm not going to be going super in-depth in the milling process in this video, it's important to know that to end up with a nice flat and square panel, you need to have square and flat boards. And that starts at the jointer if you're not buying pre-dimensioned lumber. In this case, I've got 2 sides already surfaced on this because I bought this S2S, but if you're buying rough lumber, you want to make sure you're hitting the joiner for face joining and edge joining to make sure your panel turns out great. If you're buying your lumber pre-dimensioned, like from a normal contracting store like Home Depot or Lowe's, you don't need to worry about jointing. You should have a pretty straight edge as it is if you take your time picking out your lumber at the store. I will say though, if you have a jointer, even if you're buying S4S lumber, it's still a good idea to hit one edge with the jointer and run it through the table saw to clean it up and get it perfect. Now that I've jointed and cleaned up one edge, I'm moving over to my thickness planer here where I'm going to be planing it to the final thickness that I'm looking for. Again, if you're buying your lumber pre-surfaced to the thickness that you want your panel to be, you can skip this step. So I'm hoping you guys can see this, but this is an example of when you grab red oak boards, and you actually grab one white oak board. So the board on the left is red oak, the board on the right is white oak. And you can tell from the color in this case, but sometimes it's not as obvious. And a good way to tell, which is why I have this camera view here, is by looking at the end grain. On the right, we've got a white oak board, and you can tell that because the pores of the end grain on a clean cut like this, you can tell that they're packed with, I forget what it's called, but essentially they're closed. And if you look at it from the side, you can tell that there's no pores that are open. Versus their left board, the red oak board, it basically has a bunch of holes in the end grain. And those holes allow moisture to come in, which is why white oak is actually much better for outdoor wood use than red oak. Fun fact. Quick tip for at the planer. Whenever you've planed off the rough off of both faces of your board and you're planing down to a specific thickness, it's important to remember to flip your board in between each pass. This planes you down to the center of the board versus taking all of your scrap off of one side. As the moisture content in the center of a board is typically different than on the outside of a board, if you take all of your planing off of one side, you'll have a moisture disparity in your board. Within a couple of hours of it sitting on your workbench or after you glue up your panel, your board is very likely to cup if you don't plane to the center or plane equally off of both sides. So it's a small step, but it goes a long way in keeping your panel flat over time. As we're going to be cutting our boards to their final width, it's important to remember to leave yourself a little bit of extra width on each board so that you have a chance to go back and do a cleanup jointer pass if you have any issues when you put your boards together in the next step. So for example, I want a 24-inch panel, so I'm going to leave an extra 1/8 of an inch on each board, which is going to give me about 24.5 inches because I've got 4 boards here. I can clean that up afterwards by doing a cleanup table saw pass on the final panel, or by once I lay out my boards, deciding if I need to do any jointing, and if I don't, then I can come back and clean up that width off of one of the boards or all of the boards. Although this is not a necessary step, I find this is really crucial to getting a perfect panel. Quick tip throughout the table saw: when you're doing your ripping for your glue up, it's important to use a dedicated ripping blade. A ripping blade typically has a low tooth count between 24 and 30 and a flat top grind. This is really going to help prevent burning and saw marks on the side of your boards, which is going to leave you with a much tighter glue joint when you finish gluing up your panel. It's worth the investment, trust me guys. Now that we've ripped all of our boards down to their final width, it's time to lay out the panel in a way that's going to be the most appealing, both grain-wise, color-wise, figure-wise, everything. So I'm going to look at the boards, flip them around, lay them out as best as I can, and whenever I get my final decision, I'm going to hand squeeze the boards together like so, and wherever there's any gaps, I want to make sure that hand pressure is enough to pull those gaps closed. If it requires me to clamp the gap shut, I probably need to go back to the joiner for another quick light pass. Once I've laid my panel out as aesthetically pleasing as I can, I like to put what's called a carpenter's triangle. And this is going to help me, once I put glue on, lay it back out in this exact same orientation. Additionally, at this point, once I've marked my triangle, I'm going to put a T and an A at each joint. So I'm going to go T, A, T, A, T, and A. And this is where leaving that extra 1/8 inch of width comes into play. T stands for towards my jointer fence, and A stands for away. So by doing my last cleanup passes on my jointer, one towards the fence and one away from the fence, if it's not perfectly 90 degrees, this towards and away will compensate for it, leaving me with a perfectly flat panel, even if my jointer isn't set up perfectly. Now that I've done my cleanup jointing, I'm going to make sure that when I squeeze it together, hand pressure pulls all the gaps out, which it looks like it is in this case. So now I know I am ready for glue up. An important thing to understand about wood glue is that it's stronger than the wood itself. So in this orientation, when we're gluing an edge of a board to an edge of a board, no reinforcement is needed. The bond between the boards where the glue is going to end up being stronger than the bond of the actual wood itself. So what that means is we don't need to put any mechanical fasteners, we don't need to put any wood, dowels, biscuits between the boards for it to be strong. You'll oftentimes see people use dominoes, and we do that in our shop all the time, or biscuits in between their boards just to help with alignment. But that's not because it adds strength. It's because it makes it easier to glue up a nice flat panel, and it prevents you from having to do as much sanding on the back end. For a small, simple panel like this, I usually don't put any reinforcements in because it's easy enough to sand it flat afterwards. But for a large dining tabletop, you better believe I'm putting in some dominoes to help with alignment. Biscuits are also a great option, as well as dowels if you don't have a domino joiner. If you're using stuff like F-clamps or speed clamps for gluing up panels, it's not going to be uncommon for you to see your panel bow because of the deflection in those lower quality clamps. Something like a pipe clamp is a great option for new woodworkers for gluing up panels. These are very robust clamps with a lot of force requirements, a large Acme thread screw that can put out a lot of force, and the faces tend to stay pretty parallel to one another, which is really important. An upgrade from these, though, and this is the absolute best option for gluing up large panels, is what's called a parallel clamp, which is what I have here. This is the ideal clamp for gluing up panels because these faces, when put under force, pull themselves into perfect parallel with one another. This allows you to use a tremendous amount of clamping force without buckling your panel. So it's going to help you clamp your panel not only very strong so you can close gaps, but it's also putting the force parallel to one another, which is going to help prevent your panel from bowing, cupping, and doing other weird things during glue up. These also have a tremendous amount of clamping force similar to the pipe clamps and have a very thick and robust I-beam style rail that allows them to be very long before they start to deflect. So pipe clamps are a great option, and parallel clamps are definitely the best option if you can afford it for your shop. One of the questions we get asked a lot is how many clamps is necessary when gluing up a panel? And the answer is it's kind of complicated, but the general statement is the narrower your outer boards are, so the narrower the pieces of your glue up are, but particularly on the outside of your panel, the more clamps you need, the more consistently you need to have clamps, essentially. So for something like this where I've got a 2-inch outer panel, every 6 to 8 inches is probably a good idea. If all my boards are 12 inches wide, then I don't need a ton of clamps because those panels, or those pieces of the panel, are wide enough to transmit the force pyramid across a wider range. So maybe every 12 or 18 inches is enough for that. In general, though, you're better off having too many clamps than not enough. But if you see squeeze out along the whole glue seam, that's probably a good indicator you have the right amount of clamps on there. If there's anywhere that there's not glue squeeze out, that's a good indication you maybe need to add a few clamps in that area. A quick bonus tip for when clamping your panels is to put your clamps alternating from underneath the panel to over top of the panel like you see here. Under, over, under, over. And what that does, especially with lower end clamps, is it helps to offset the deflection that the clamp rails have. So if you're using pipe clamps or lower end clamps, you'll definitely benefit from this because the bow that your clamps put in the board will kind of offset each other as you go across the panel, which is a really good thing. Parallel clamps is not as necessary, but it doesn't hurt, so I like to do that anyways. All right, now that we've covered clamping a little bit, I want to go over how I actually do my physical glue up. So in this case, not using anything to reinforce it, but I'm going to flip up every board but the last one in the same way. So I'm pulling from the back end and flipping it up. The key is to pull from the same direction so you don't accidentally flip over a board. I'm going to leave this last board here, and the reason is because I don't want to flip this one up and put glue on the outside of that board. So leaving it flat, I don't have to worry about that. When it comes to gluing up panels, there's two trains of thoughts when it comes to, do you need to glue both edges or just one edge? And as somebody who's never had a panel come unglued on me, I only do one edge, and that's my recommendation to you. It doesn't hurt to glue both edges, but it's very tricky to do without getting glue all over your workbench. Gluing one edge, I can glue it while it's vertical, lay it down, and clamp it. I'm done. But to glue this edge and then handle this board to flip it over and glue the other edge is very tricky. I'm going to put that glued edge either on my clamp rails or on my workbench or on, paper if you put paper down. It's just very messy, and I don't think it's necessary, but to each his own. As far as which type of glue you use, I definitely recommend conventional Titebond glue. You can use Titebond 1, Titebond 2, or Titebond 3 for panel glue ups. All are going to be plenty strong. The reason I personally opt for Titebond 3 for panel glue ups like this isn't because of strength or waterproofness in most cases, but it's actually for the longer open time. So Titebond 3 has a 6-minute open time, which gives me plenty of time to put down the glue, spread it out with my brush, clamp it, make any adjustments I need. Titebond Original, however, it's perfectly strong and capable of doing the job. You only have about 3 minutes of open time, which for some glue ups is plenty, but for others is a little bit tight. So Titebond 3 is my personal go-to, but I think any of the traditional Titebond line will work really well for you. If you noticed when I was doing my glue up, I made sure to get extra glue at the ends of each board. If a board is going to delaminate from another board, it's going to happen first at the ends, so you want to make sure you've got plenty of extra glue at the end of each joint. As I start to clamp this panel together, I'm going to start in the middle and work my way out. I've found this to be the easiest approach to getting everything lined up nice and neat. If you're using dominoes, dowels, or biscuits to line it up, you don't really have to stress about this. I'm also going to make sure not to over-tighten my clamps when I'm first starting to tighten them up. I want to make sure that each clamp gets a little bit of pressure before I crank anything down. This helps both with alignment and it helps making sure that everything stays nice and flat and I'm still able to adjust it as I go across my panel. As you can tell here, I've only lightly tightened my center two clamps and I've got squeezed out almost the full length. This is because I've got really well-jointed edges that are nice and flat. So these boards want to come together as I tighten them up. I don't need a ton of clamps to do this because the boards are really straight, and of course wider boards would make this even more noticeable. It's also a good idea to make sure to put a clamp at the very end of your panel on both sides. And again, this is because if anything is going to delaminate, it's going to start at the end of your board. So you want to make sure you've got plenty of glue and plenty of clamping force in line with the end of your panels. Once you've got good squeeze out along the whole length of your joints, it's not necessary to put any more clamping pressure at that point. The only thing clamping past the point of glue squeeze out is going to do is potentially warp your panel. So I recommend lightly clamping all of your clamps and then adjusting all of them slowly until you get good squeeze out across your whole panel. There's a lot of different approaches people take to getting rid of the glue. Some people like to scrape it while it's kind of gummed up. Some people like to sand it afterwards. Some people like to use a wet rag and get it while it's still not dried yet. But my personal preference is to wait till it's dried, take it out of the clamps, and just sand it. I'm already going to be sanding this thing a lot with low grit to flatten it back down, get rid of any seams between the wood that shifts. So there's not really much benefit to wasting my time wiping down a panel glue up. That's just my personal preference though. Find what works best for you in your shop. Another common question woodworkers ask is, how long does my panel need to be in the clamps? And the answer is, it depends. Is your shop climate controlled? Are you using Titebond 1, 2, or 3, or polyurethane glue, or a different kind of glue? Definitely look at the back of your glue bottle for the best reference, but in general, I like to leave my panels drying overnight. Typically 4 to 5 hours is enough time, but in a shop like ours where we work on one piece of furniture typically at a time, waiting overnight for a panel to dry is not that big of a deal. If I put it in the clamps in the middle of a work day, sometimes by the evening I'll take it out and start flattening it. But you don't want to do anything too crazy with it, like heavy planing or cutting dados or anything like that until it's had plenty of time for that glue to cure. Now that we've got our panel out of our clamps, it's time to start sanding this thing flat. Another option would be to use a card scraper or a hand plane to flatten this thing out. Or, if you have a planer big enough to handle your panel, you can run it through the planer, although I would definitely sand off or scrape off your glue before you do that. My personal preference for flattening panels that are too wide to fit through my planer like this is just to go to town with my sander. I don't like to scrape or plane. I find I end up messing things up more than helping. And if you did a good job flattening your boards and taking your time and your glue up, there's not really a whole lot of sanding to do other than to clean up a little bit of the seams here and there. So if you start with a low enough grit like 60 or 80 grit and work your way up to your final grit, it's not that much time overall. Just make sure not to skip grits on your sanding. It's not uncommon in big, beautiful, wide boards to have small defects in the middle of it that you just can't get around, like these cracks right here. It's pretty stable looking, so I'm going to fill it with some CA glue from Starbond, and that's going to seal it right up, and it's going to look super cool in the process. Get to leave the character in, but prevent the wood from cracking further down the road. So I definitely recommend getting yourself some CA glue. My favorite is the medium for stuff like this. Now that we've flattened our panel and we've sanded it, it's time to move on to cutting it to its final width and length. You can cut your panels to final length in a couple of different ways. You can use a circular saw with an edge guide, a track saw, or you can use your table saw with a crosscut sled or a sliding table like we have on our table saw. All of these are great options. So now that we got our panel cut to its final length, it's time to bring it into its final width. If you planned your panel out perfectly to be exactly the right size after glue up, you can skip this step. But if not, there's two good options for bringing your panel down to final width. First is run it through the table saw. If it's not a super large panel, that's a great option. Alternatively, you can use a track saw or a circular saw with an edge guide to bring it into its final width. Now that we've ripped it to its final width, it's ready for final sanding. We're going to hit it with 220, and then it'll be ready for finish. When working with solid wood panels, it's important to remember to seal both the top and the bottom surfaces of your panel. Although you may not be interacting with the bottom surface, it's important to seal it so that moisture cannot enter at a different rate through the bottom of your panel than the top. This will help ensure your panel stays nice and flat for a long time. Last but not least, I want to talk on the importance of allowing for wood movement in your panel. When you're working with solid wood panels like this tabletop we just made, it's important to remember that it's going to want to expand and contract along its width. If I simply screw in from the base into the tabletop, it's not going to be able to expand and contract, and it will crack down the road due to wood movement. Two great options to allow for wood movement that are really approachable are tabletop clips and figure 8 clips. Both of these are ways to attach the tabletop to its base, but allow for wood movement, and they're easy to install. So check out those videos we've done in the past on those two options. If you're not already, go ahead and follow us and hit that notification bell so you guys can be notified when we release content like this in the future. And if you enjoyed the video, we'd appreciate a like, and down in the comments, let us know which tip or trick you found most useful. Thanks, guys.